My dad uninvited me from New Year's. 2 days later, my brother's wife applied for a job at my law firm. What happened next, no one expected. My name is Claire Bennett. I am 34 years old. I was standing in my father's kitchen on the afternoon of December 30th, holding a bottle of sparkling cider I had bought for the family toast, when my father set down his coffee cup and told me I wouldn't be needed at New Year's this year. He said it the way you'd tell an employee their shift got cut. No warm-up, no cushion, just a flat sentence dropped into the middle of an ordinary afternoon. He said Daniel and Vanessa wanted the house to themselves this year, that they had big news to celebrate, and that it would mean a lot if I gave them the space. I asked him what news. He said I'd find out when everyone else did. I stood there with the cider bottle sweating in my hand and felt something in my chest go very quiet and very still, the way a room goes still right before a storm hits a coastline. My father is not a cruel man in the way people picture cruelty. He doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't slam doors. He simply decides in some private courtroom inside his own head who matters more in a given season, and he expects the rest of us to accept the verdict without an appeal. This time the verdict was that I didn't belong in my own family's living room on New Year's Eve. I said okay, put the cider back in the paper bag, and drove home in silence. 2 days later, on January 1st, I was catching up on hiring notifications at the law firm where I've spent 11 years building a career, and one name in the applicant pipeline made my stomach drop: Vanessa Cole, my brother's fiancée, the same woman who was, at that exact moment, supposedly celebrating big news in my father's living room, had submitted an application to join my firm, in my department, 2 days after I was told to stay away from my own family's holiday. Before I tell you exactly what was in that application, and what it cost her, and what it cost my father, tell me what time it is right now where you're watching this, and what city you're sitting in, because where you are, and how you protect your own peace, matters more than you know. If you've ever been the one told to sit out your own family's celebration, hit subscribe right now, because this story is for you. And there are a lot more like it waiting for you here. I grew up understanding the shape of my family long before I understood the shape of most other things. My father, Robert Bennett, ran a small but respected accounting practice out of a 2-story office on 5th Street. And from the time I was 7 years old, my younger brother Daniel was positioned as the future of that practice, the way some families groom a child for the family farm or the family name on a shingle. I was groomed for something else entirely, which was usefulness. I remember being 11 years old, sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of flashcards for a spelling bee I had been practicing for 6 weeks, when my father asked me to set them aside because Daniel needed help finding his baseball glove before practice. I found the glove. I missed the 15 minutes I'd carved out to run through my last set of words. I placed second in that spelling. B, 1 word short of first, and I remember standing on that stage thinking about the glove instead of the microphone in front of me. Nobody in my family ever said the words "your brother matters more than you" out loud. They didn't have to. The math did the talking. When I was 16, I was accepted into a summer pre-law program at a university 2 states away, a program with a waiting list longer than the acceptance list, and I remember running into the kitchen with the acceptance letter shaking in my hand. My father read it, nodded once and said, "That's wonderful," and then, almost in the same breath, mentioned that Daniel's travel baseball team had made regionals that same week, and that the family would need to plan around the tournament schedule. I went to the summer program alone, drove myself the 6 hours because nobody was available to take me, and came home to find that the framed photo on the mantel from that entire summer was of Daniel holding a regional trophy. There was no photo of my acceptance letter. There never was one. I kept telling myself that this was simply how families worked, that some children are the son and some children are the ones who make sure the son has clean clothes and a ride to practice, and that my job was to be steady, capable, and quiet about the imbalance. I surrendered so many times in so many small ways that surrendering started to feel like love. I gave up my seat at the table, my turn in the spotlight, my say in family decisions, because peace in that house was purchased with my silence, and I paid the price without ever being asked if I wanted to. The moment that changed wasn't loud. It happened 3 years ago, at my grandmother's funeral, when my father stood up to deliver remarks and spent almost the entire eulogy describing Daniel's accomplishments, his new position at a regional bank, his engagement plans, his bright future, while I sat in the second row, having flown in on 4 hours' notice. Having handled the funeral home logistics, the flower orders, the obituary, and the seating chart entirely alone, because Daniel was, in my father's words, too broken up to deal with logistics. My father mentioned me once in that eulogy. He said, "Claire helped out a lot, too." Helped out. 11 years of showing up, of covering shifts nobody else wanted to cover, reduced to 2 words at my own grandmother's funeral, while my brother received 5 uninterrupted minutes of praise for a job he hadn't even started yet. I sat in that pew and made a decision so quiet that nobody around me noticed it happening. I decided that I would stop auditioning for a role in my family that had already been cast without me. I didn't confront anyone that day. I didn't need to. I simply stopped expecting fairness and started paying attention instead, because attention, I was about to learn, is the most powerful tool a quiet person can own. For the next 3 years, I kept my head down, built my career, made partner track at my firm, and watched my family's dynamics from a careful distance, the way you'd watch weather patterns from behind reinforced glass. Then came the New Year's call, and then came the applicant notification 2 days later, and everything that had been simmering quietly under the surface for 2 decades finally had a shape I could hold in my hands. When I saw Vanessa Cole's name in our firm's applicant tracking system, my first instinct was disbelief, the kind that makes you reread a sentence 3 times because your brain refuses to accept what your eyes are telling it. Vanessa was not a stranger applying cold. Vanessa was engaged to my brother. A licensed attorney herself, currently employed at a mid-sized firm 2 towns over, and, according to my father's version of events, she was supposed to be sitting in his living room at that exact moment, celebrating an engagement announcement so private that I wasn't allowed to witness it. Did not confront anyone. I did not send an angry text. I did what 11 years of practicing law had trained me to do when something doesn't add up. I gathered facts. I opened the applicant file properly, the way I would for any candidate, and started reading. The resume looked polished on the surface, well formatted, strong verbs, a section highlighting 3 years of litigation support at Whitfield and Marsh, the firm 2 towns over where Vanessa was supposedly employed. Something about the dates felt off, so I pulled up our internal verification checklist and started cross-referencing. The employment dates on Vanessa's resume claimed continuous employment at Whitfield and Marsh from a specific month 3 years prior through the present day. I had, coincidentally, worked opposite Whitfield and Marsh on a joint venture case 18 months earlier, and I remembered clearly that the associate handling document review on their side during that case was not Vanessa Cole. It was a different name. Entirely. A name I still had saved in my case correspondence archive from that matter. I pulled the old case file, found the email chain, and confirmed it. Vanessa was not listed anywhere in the case correspondence, not in the CC line, not in a single internal memo, despite her resume claiming she was a lead associate on litigation matters during that exact window. That was strange, but not yet damning. People get shuffled off cases for all kinds of reasons, so I did what any careful attorney does before. Drawing a conclusion, I called our firm's credentialing coordinator, a woman named Priya who handles background verification for every incoming hire, and asked her, in a completely neutral tone, to run the standard pre-screen on the newest applicant in the pipeline before it advanced any further. The same request I make for every candidate, nothing unusual about it on the surface. Priya came back to me 2 business days later with a file that made the quiet, still feeling in my chest from New Year's Eve, turn into something colder and far more focused. The State Bar Association's public record showed that Vanessa Cole had been placed on a 9-month practice suspension 14 months earlier following a client complaint involving mishandled trust account funds on a real estate closing. The suspension had been resolved through a private consent agreement, the kind that doesn't make headlines but absolutely does show up on a formal bar record check, the exact kind of check every reputable firm runs before extending an offer. Whitfield and Marsh had quietly let her go during that suspension window, which explained why she wasn't listed anywhere in our joint case file from that period. And Vanessa had spent the better part of a year doing contract document review work under a staffing agency, work that doesn't require active bar standing to perform, before her suspension lifted and she was eligible to practice again. None of that made her a criminal. People make mistakes, serve their consequences, and rebuild. What made my stomach turn cold was not the suspension itself. It was the resume sitting in front of me, claiming 3 unbroken years of litigation leadership at a firm that had actually let her go, submitted to my employer in my department, 2 days after my father told me to disappear from a family celebration that was apparently being held in her honor. I sat with that file for a long time before I did anything else. I thought about every dinner where Daniel had been given the first serving, every milestone of mine that got folded into a footnote, every time I had swallowed the unfairness because raising it felt like more trouble than it was worth. And then I thought about something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with old grievances and everything to do with the present moment. If Vanessa's application succeeded and nobody caught the discrepancy, she would be sitting 3 floors below my office, handling client files, holding herself out as a fully vetted attorney at a firm that takes its reputation seriously, based on a resume that misrepresented a material fact about her professional history. That wasn't a family matter anymore. That was a professional integrity matter, and professional integrity matters have a very specific, very unemotional process. And I happen to know that process cold. I want to be honest about something here, because this is the part of the story where a lot of people expect me to describe some dramatic confrontation, some scene where I show up at my father's house and unload 20 years of resentment onto the dinner table. That is not what happened, and it is not what I recommend to anyone listening to this who finds themselves in a similar position. The version of justice that actually works, the version that holds up, is boring on the surface and devastating underneath. It is built out of documents, timestamps, verified records, and calm procedural steps, not out of raised voices. My first call was not to my father, and it was not to Daniel. It was to our firm's hiring committee chair, a partner named Gerald Whitman, whom I've worked alongside for 9 years and who has never once seen me raise my voice in a conference room. I requested a standard hiring integrity review, the exact process our firm applies whenever a credentialing discrepancy surfaces during background verification, regardless of who the applicant happens to be. I disclosed, plainly and without embellishment, that the applicant was engaged to my brother, and that I would be recusing myself from any further involvement in her candidacy to avoid even the appearance of a conflict. Gerald asked one question. He asked if I was certain about the resume discrepancy. I told him I had the Bar Association's public consent order, the internal case correspondence from the joint venture matter 18 months earlier, showing her absence from the case team during the claimed employment window, and Priya's formal background report, all 3 pointing to the same timeline gap. Gerald thanked me for flagging it early and told me the matter would go through standard review, the same review every applicant with a credentialing flag goes through, no exceptions, no shortcuts. That was the entire conversation. 4 minutes, maybe 5. No confrontation, no accusation. Just facts placed into the hands of the people whose job it is to evaluate facts. While the hiring review moved through its normal channel, I turned my attention to something that had been bothering me since the moment my father told me to skip. New Year's. A question that had nothing to do with Vanessa's resume and everything to do with why she had applied to my firm specifically, out of every firm within a 2-hour radius, 2 days after that phone call. I am not a person who believes in coincidence when a pattern is sitting right in front of me, so I started looking at the pattern. I remembered that 6 weeks earlier, at a birthday dinner for my mother, my father had spent an unusual amount of time asking me about my firm's upcoming partnership vote, a vote scheduled for the following spring that would determine whether I moved from senior associate to equity partner, a position that comes with a meaningful ownership stake in the firm's client base and future earnings. At the time, I assumed it was ordinary fatherly curiosity, the kind of question a parent asks because they want to seem interested in your career. Looking back at it with new eyes, I realized my father had asked very specific questions. He asked how many partners were voting. He asked whether the vote was based on seniority or on a point system tied to client origination. He asked whether outside hires could ever be brought in laterally at a senior level if they brought existing client relationships with them. I had answered honestly because I had no reason not to, explaining that lateral partners occasionally get brought in when they bring a substantial book of business, and that the firm had done exactly that twice in the past 5 years. I didn't think about that conversation again until I was sitting with Vanessa's flagged resume, staring at her cover letter, which mentioned, almost in passing, that she was excited about the opportunity to bring her existing real estate and estate planning client relationships to a firm with a stronger platform for growth. Estate planning. My father's accounting practice handles a significant volume of estate and trust work for long-standing clients, work that regularly requires legal counsel, work that my father has, for years, referred out to whichever attorney happened to be convenient at the time. I pulled up my firm's internal client origination records and found something that made the whole picture snap into focus with the kind of clarity that only comes when you finally have every piece of a puzzle in your hands at once. Over the previous 4 months, 3 new estate planning referrals had come into my firm through an intake code marked External Referral, Family Connection, each one tagged with a note referencing Robert Bennett Accounting as the referring party. My father had begun quietly, funneling his own long-standing accounting clients toward my law firm, not toward me, but toward the firm generally, positioning himself as a valuable referral source in the months leading up to a partnership vote where client origination points would matter enormously. If Vanessa joined my firm as a lateral hire, and my father continued referring his estate planning clients specifically to her, she would begin accumulating origination credit almost immediately, credit that could position her for an accelerated path toward partnership consideration herself. Within a year or two, all while my father maintained enormous influence over which relationships got steered where. It wasn't only about giving Daniel's fiancé a career boost, it was about building leverage inside my own firm, leverage my father could use to influence outcomes, including, eventually, outcomes that might affect my own partnership trajectory, since firms weigh client origination heavily, and a rising lateral hire with a growing referral pipeline from an outside accounting practice would immediately become a significant player in exactly the kind of point system my father had asked me about 6 weeks earlier. I did not need to guess at motive to act. I only needed the documentation, and by the second week of January, I had all of it laid out in a single folder, time-stamped and sourced, the way I would build any case file for a client. The applicant resume with the fabricated employment continuity claim. The Bar Association's public consent order confirming the suspension. The internal case correspondence proving her absence from the joint venture case team during the claimed employment window. The client origination log showing my father's referral pattern beginning 4 months prior. The birthday dinner conversation, which I wrote down from memory as closely as I could reconstruct it, dated and noted as recollection rather than record, because I believe in being precise about what is proof and what is simply context. I did not send this folder to my father. I did not send it to Daniel. I sent a narrow, professional version of it, the parts relevant to hiring integrity only, to Gerald Whitman and our firm's compliance officer, exactly as our internal policy requires, and I let the process run on its own track, without my fingerprints anywhere, near the outcome beyond the initial mandatory disclosure. The hiring committee's review took 11 days. During those 11 days, I did not speak to my father. I did not speak to Daniel. I went to work, handled my caseload, and waited. The way you wait for a storm system you can see clearly on the radar. Calm because you know exactly what's coming and you've already moved everything breakable out of its path. While the review was still in progress, before anyone in the family knew what I had already found, Daniel called to invite me to a small engagement celebration dinner at my parents' house, 7 days before the hiring decision came down. A dinner I almost declined out of habit before deciding that showing up, calm and unremarkable, was worth more than staying home and letting my absence be noticed twice in one season. I arrived at 7, brought a bottle of wine for the table, and found Vanessa already holding court in the living room, describing to my Aunt Linda and 2 family friends how thrilled she was about her upcoming move to a stronger firm, gesturing with the easy confidence of someone who has never once had a resume questioned in her life. She used the word platform 3 times in under a minute, the exact word from her cover letter, and I remember standing near the doorway with my coat still half on, listening to her perform a version of her career that I already knew with documented certainty wasn't true. My father stood near the fireplace, nodding along, occasionally adding a comment about how nice it would be to keep things close to home, and I watched Daniel refill Vanessa's glass with the proud, oblivious warmth of a man who has no idea he is standing inside a story that is about to end very differently than the one being told in that room. Nobody at that dinner asked me a single question about my own work that evening, though Vanessa did turn to me at one point, glass in hand, and mention, almost as an afterthought, that she hoped it wouldn't be too strange working in the same building as me, since firms like mine could always use someone with her level of client relationships. I told her evenly that I was sure the hiring committee would give her application a thorough and fair review, the same review every candidate receives, and I watched her smile widen slightly, mistaking my calm for an endorsement rather than what it actually was, which was patience. I left that dinner early, citing an early morning deposition, and drove home with the folder still sitting closed on my passenger seat where it had been. For days, thinking about how easily a room full of people will applaud a performance when nobody in the audience has bothered to check whether the script is true. On the 12th day, Gerald called me into his office and told me the hiring committee had voted unanimously to withdraw Vanessa Cole's application, citing a material misrepresentation on her submitted resume regarding continuous employment history. A misrepresentation that, once verified against the Bar Association's public record, constituted grounds for immediate disqualification under the firm's hiring integrity policy. He also mentioned, almost as an aside, that the firm's general counsel had flagged the pattern of estate planning referrals coming from Robert Bennett Accounting and would be reviewing whether any of those referral arrangements needed formal disclosure documentation going forward, purely as a matter of standard compliance housekeeping. Nothing accusatory, simply due diligence. I thanked him, went back to my office, closed the door, and sat very still for a long moment, feeling something settle inside me that had been unsettled since I was 11 years old, holding a set of spelling flashcards nobody had time for. Before the hiring committee's review even concluded, I did one more thing, quietly, on my own time, because I wanted to understand the full shape of what I was dealing with before anyone else's decisions could be influenced by an incomplete picture. I drove to the county recorder's office on a Thursday afternoon during my lunch hour, the kind of errand nobody notices you running because it looks like nothing at all. A woman in a gray blazer standing at a public records terminal, and pulled the filing history on 3 real estate closings that had passed through Whitfield and Marsh during the exact window Vanessa's resume claimed she had led litigation matters there. Public record is public record, available to anyone. Willing to sit at a terminal and be patient, and patience has never been something I lacked. 2 of the 3 closings listed a different attorney of record entirely, the same name I remembered from the joint venture case file, and the 3rd closing, the one connected to the client complaint referenced in the Bar Association's consent order, listed Vanessa Cole as counsel of record, with a closing date that fell squarely inside the suspension window she had conveniently left off her resume. Sat in my car in the recorder's office parking lot afterward, engine off, printout on the passenger seat, and felt the last piece of the picture settle into place, with the quiet click of a lock finally catching. This wasn't a woman who had simply rounded up her resume the way ambitious people sometimes do. This was a woman who had built a specific, deliberate narrative designed to survive a background check that assumed nobody would look past the surface, and the only reason it hadn't already worked was that the surface happened to belong to my department, at my firm, 2 days after I had been told I wasn't wanted at the celebration announcing her engagement. I photocopied the recorder's office documents, added them to the folder, and noted the date and source clearly at the top of the page. The same habit I use for every piece of evidence I've ever built a case around. Because a fact without a source is just an opinion wearing a nicer coat. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with the folder closed in front of me and did something I hadn't done in a long time. I let myself feel the weight of it, not the anger. That part had already burned down to something colder and steadier days earlier. But the simple, physical exhaustion of having spent 20 years absorbing small unfairness after small unfairness without ever once building a file on any of it. I thought about the spelling bee, the pre-law program, the eulogy, the years of quiet accommodation, and I realized that the folder in front of me wasn't really about Vanessa's resume at all. It was the first time in my adult life I had allowed myself to treat my own family's behavior with the same rigor I would apply to any other case. And something about that shift felt less like anger and more like relief. The specific relief of finally putting a name to a pattern you've spent years pretending not to see. I want to pause here and tell you something important. Because this is the part of these stories where things usually turn loud, and I need you to understand why mine didn't. I never called Vanessa to gloat. I never called Daniel to explain what I had found. I never called my father to tell him I knew exactly what he had been building behind my back. The truth did that work for me, the same way it always does when you let facts stand on their own instead of dressing them up with emotion. News like a rescinded job offer does not stay contained. Within 4 days of the hiring committee's decision, my mother called me, her voice tight in a way I hadn't heard in years, asking if I knew anything about why Vanessa's new job had suddenly fallen through, because apparently Vanessa had already told several relatives about her exciting move to a larger firm, and now she was having to explain to those same relatives why the move wasn't happening after all. I told my mother, honestly and without elaboration, that I had learned during a routine background check that there had been a discrepancy on her resume, and that hiring decisions at my firm are handled by a committee, not by me individually, and that I wasn't in a position to discuss a personnel matter further. That was true. Every word of it was true. My mother went quiet on the phone for a moment and then asked a question that told me everything about how far this had already traveled, inside the family before it ever reached me. She asked whether this had anything to do with the accounting referrals your father's been sending her way. Asked my mother what she knew about that. What she told me next confirmed the picture I had already assembled from documents alone, except now I was hearing it in my mother's own words, unprompted, unaware that she was essentially corroborating a case file I had already closed. My mother said my father had been talking for months about wanting to keep the family's professional relationships close, about not wanting his accounting clients handled by outside attorneys he didn't know or trust, and about how having Daniel's fiancée positioned at a strong firm would make it easier to keep everything, in his words, in the family. My mother said she hadn't thought much of it at the time, assuming it was simply my father being proud of Daniel's choice of partner. I asked my mother, as gently as I could, whether she remembered anything about New Year's Eve, about why I had been told to stay away. There was a long pause. My mother said my father had told her I was busy with work and had asked for the space myself, which was not what he had told me and was, in fact, the opposite of what he had told me. That was the moment I understood that my father hadn't simply excluded me from a family gathering. He had actively misrepresented the reason to my mother, protecting his own image inside the household while quietly building a professional arrangement that used my absence as convenient cover, so that nobody would ask uncomfortable questions about why the daughter who works at the exact firm in question wasn't included in a celebration connected to that very firm. I did not raise my voice with my mother. I simply told her the truth. Plainly, the way I had learned to deliver difficult facts in a conference room. I said I had never asked for space on New Year's Eve, that Dad had called me and told me Daniel and Vanessa wanted the house to themselves, and that I had spent the holiday alone because I trusted what my own father told me about my own family's plans. My mother was quiet for a long time after that. The family group chat, the one used mostly for birthday reminders and holiday photos, had been unusually active over the following week, and I want to describe what happened there, not because I orchestrated it, but because it is a clear example of what happens when documented truth reaches people who have been kept in the dark. Daniel posted first, a short message asking if anyone knew why Vanessa's job offer had been pulled, clearly frustrated, clearly not yet understanding the full picture himself. My aunt, Linda, who has always had a sharp memory for details, responded asking whether this was the same job Vanessa had been talking about at Christmas, the one at Claire's firm, and if so, why nobody had mentioned that connection before now. My mother, who, by that point had already spoken with me privately, responded with a message that surprised me, stating plainly that she had learned Claire wasn't told the truth about why she was asked to skip New Year's, and that some conversations needed to happen as a family before anyone said anything further in the group chat. My father did not respond in the group chat at all. He called me directly instead, 3 days later, on a Sunday evening, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, his voice did not carry the flat, decided certainty I had grown up with. He asked if we could talk. I said yes, but not about feelings, only about facts, and that if he wanted to have that conversation, it needed to happen somewhere both of us could speak plainly without an audience performing for each other, which is how we ended up agreeing to meet at his office on 5th Street the following Tuesday evening after his staff had gone home. Just the two of us, at a conference table where he had once tried to teach me long division on the back of a client invoice when I was 9 years old. I arrived at 6:15, carrying a single folder, the same one I had built weeks earlier, though the version in my hands that evening had grown to include the family group chat screenshots and a brief written timeline I had prepared for my own clarity, not for dramatic effect. My father was already seated at the conference table when I walked in, his coffee cup in front of him, untouched, and I noticed that his hands, folded on the table, were not entirely still. I sat down across from him and did not raise my voice once during the entire conversation that followed, because I had learned, over 11 years of practicing law and over 20 years of surviving that particular household, that calm is not the absence of power. Calm, delivered with documentation in hand, is the most powerful thing in the room. I told my father that I knew about the referral pattern. The estate planning clients quietly routed to my firm over the previous 4 months under his name. I told him I had the internal origination log with dates. He started to say something about wanting to keep things in the family, and I asked him, calmly, to define the family he meant, because from where I was sitting, I had been asked to leave that family's living room on New Year's Eve so that a woman with a fabricated resume could be positioned to benefit from exactly the arrangement he had just admitted to building. He went quiet. I told him about the bar, association's consent order, the 9-month suspension, the mishandled trust account funds, and watched something shift across his face, a flicker of genuine surprise that told me he hadn't known, that Vanessa had kept that part from him entirely, which meant my father hadn't only excluded me from a holiday to protect a business arrangement. He had built that entire arrangement on a foundation he hadn't even bothered to verify. I told him that our firm's general counsel was reviewing the referral pattern for compliance disclosure purposes, not as an accusation against him personally, but as standard practice whenever a pattern like that surfaces, and that depending on what that review found, his accounting practice might need to formally disclose the referral relationship going forward or discontinue it, if any compensation or informal understanding had been attached to those referrals in a way that created a conflict of interest under our firm's ethics rules. My father asked quietly whether there had been compensation attached. I told him that wasn't a question I could answer because I had recused myself from the entire matter the moment I flagged it, and that the general counsel's review would determine that independently, without any input from me. He asked if this meant Daniel and Vanessa's engagement was somehow at risk because of what I had done. I told him, as plainly as I could, that I hadn't done anything to Vanessa except run a standard background check. The exact same check every applicant at my firm goes through, and that whatever came apart in that relationship or that engagement had come apart because of choices Vanessa and my father had made long before I ever opened that applicant file. Said I hadn't asked her to fabricate 3 years of continuous employment on a resume. I hadn't asked him to build a referral pipeline that used my exclusion from a family holiday as cover. All I had done was notice what was directly in front of me, verify it properly, and let the truth move through the proper channels instead of staying buried the way so many uncomfortable truths in our family had stayed buried for 20 years. My father sat with that for a long moment, and then he asked me something I hadn't expected, something that told me he was finally, for the first time in my adult life, seeing the shape of what he had built. He asked if I had done any of this because I was angry about New Year's. Told him the truth. I told him I wasn't angry about one holiday. I was tired of 2 decades of being the daughter who covers the shifts nobody else wants to cover, who gets 2 words in a eulogy while her brother gets 5 uninterrupted minutes, who gets asked to disappear so that other people's celebrations have more room to breathe, and that somewhere along the way I had simply stopped being willing to disappear on command. I told him this wasn't revenge. Revenge would have meant calling Vanessa myself and telling her I knew exactly what she'd done. Revenge would have meant showing up to his office with the intention of making him feel as small as he had made me feel at that funeral. I hadn't done either of those things. I had done my job. The same job I would have done for any applicant with a credentialing discrepancy, and the rest had simply been the natural consequence of building something on a foundation nobody had bothered to check. The General Counsel's compliance review concluded 3 weeks later, and it found that while no direct compensation had changed hands between my father's accounting practice and my firm, the referral pattern would need to be formally disclosed going forward under a standard conflict of interest policy, given the family relationship involved, a requirement my father accepted without objection. Because by that point, he understood there was no version of pushing back that would look anything other than exactly what it was. Vanessa's engagement to Daniel ended 6 weeks after the hiring committee's decision, not because of anything I said or did, but because, according to my mother, Daniel had learned about the suspension and the fabricated resume from a conversation with my father, and had asked Vanessa directly why she had never told him about any of it, a conversation that apparently did not go well for anyone involved. I want to be careful here, because this is the part of the story where it would be easy to feel triumphant about someone else's relationship falling apart, and that isn't the point I want to leave you with. I take no satisfaction in Daniel's engagement ending. I take no satisfaction in Vanessa losing a job opportunity she might have earned honestly if she had simply told the truth on her application. What I take satisfaction in is much smaller and much quieter than any of that. Take satisfaction in the fact that when a fabricated document tried to move through my professional world, the proper process caught it, the way it's supposed to, and I take satisfaction in the fact that when I finally stopped performing peace for a family that had never offered me the same courtesy, the truth held up exactly as well as I had trusted it would. The New Year's after all of this, the one that came almost exactly 12 months after that first cold phone call in my father's kitchen, looked very different. I hosted it myself, in my own apartment, with my mother, my 2 closest friends, and, for the first time in longer than I could remember, my father, who arrived early, brought the same brand of sparkling cider I had carried into his kitchen the year before, and asked quietly if it would be all right if he stayed for the whole evening this time. I said yes. Not because everything between us had been repaired, because it hadn't, not fully, and I don't think it ever will be in the way it might have been if none of this had happened. I said yes because for the first time, he was asking instead of deciding, and that shift, small as it sounds, meant more to me than any apology he could have offered in words. Daniel and I speak now, carefully, the way 2 people rebuild a bridge, one plank at a time after a storm has washed most of it away. He told me once, months later, over coffee, that he didn't blame me for what happened, that he understood I had simply done my job, and that the parts of his relationship with Vanessa that couldn't survive the truth probably weren't built to survive much of anything in the first place. I appreciated him saying that, though I noticed he still hadn't apologized for 20 years of being the sun in a household where I was expected to be the weather that made his days pleasant. I don't need that apology anymore, not the way I once did. I have learned, slowly and expensively, that self-respect and revenge look similar from the outside but feel entirely different from the inside. Revenge wants someone else to suffer. Self-respect simply wants the truth to be visible. And then it wants you to build a life where you are never again asked to disappear so someone else's celebration can have more room. I changed the locks on that particular door a long time before this story ever started. I just didn't realize it until a fabricated resume showed up in my applicant queue and gave me a reason to finally check whether the door was still open. It wasn't, not anymore, and I have no plans to reopen it for anyone who isn't willing to walk through it honestly. So I'll leave you with the same question I've been sitting with since that quiet afternoon in my father's kitchen. Where is the line for you between keeping the peace and disappearing yourself to maintain it? And how would you know if you had already crossed it? Thank you for listening to my story all the way to the end. If it meant something to you, if any part of it felt familiar, please like this video, subscribe for more stories like this one, and tell me in the comments where you were when you finally stopped disappearing for someone else's comfort. This story is a work of fiction, created for entertainment purposes, and any resemblance to real individuals or events is purely coincidental.